All right, we're here with Fletcher Prouty, and it is now May 6th, 1989, beginning a series of questions regarding his book published in 1973 by Prentice Hall called The Secret Team. One of the most essential parts of post-World War II American political action and agendas seem to hinge on events that happened immediately after World War II. With the passage of the National Security Act of 1947, why don't you discuss the original intent of Congress of the role of the CIA as specified in this law?
The Germans and the Japanese and the Italians, who were our enemy in World War II, are all now friends. So you must go back into that era and begin there when you talk about the origins of CIA and the passage of this very important law, the National Security Act of 1947. Because I was teaching a major course, a year-long course at Yale called The Evolution of Warfare, I was very interested, of necessity interested, in these activities of 1946 and 47 as part of my course. So I read everything I could get from the congressional hearings, from the newspapers, everything that was going in those years toward the creation of this law, this new law. Now, one of the problems during World War II was not that we did not have enough intelligence. It was that it wasn't coordinated. The intelligence that General MacArthur and Admiral Nimitz had in the Pacific was not always coordinated with the intelligence that General Eisenhower and General Bradley and their allies had in the European theater. And a lot of times Washington had different intelligence from different sources and didn't have the means to coordinate it properly for the overall benefit of our military forces who are fighting all over the world. And we had new ways of gathering intelligence. We had new electronic means. Radar was used to gather intelligence. We had aerial photography. We had all kinds of devices that were not in the ordinary James Bond intelligence of pre-war days. So the Congress understood from a lot of testimony from experienced military leaders that one of the greatest shortages and one of the greatest mistakes in the war was that we did not have coordinated intelligence. So when Congress wrote the language of this legislation for the CIA, and I printed this literally in the book so that anyone that wants to read it will see exactly what the law says. It said that the CIA is created to coordinate the intelligence of the rest of the government. And that was why it was created. With that as the primary duty of CIA, then the other little tasks and things that we're supposed to do come forward. Mm-hmm. And it's a better explanation. In fact, it is the only explanation when it is put that way. There was not a single word, for example, in the law that said that the CIA should collect intelligence. There wasn't a single word in the law that said the CIA should get involved in covert operations. And this is the same law that exists today, by the way. The people that first became members of this new CIA knew that their job was the coordination of intelligence. I have no doubt. Well, as the CIA started late in 47, it was primarily a rollover of World War II trained military people. The head of it was an admiral, Admiral Hillenkoetter. Mm-hmm. And I think out of the number that they had, over 5,000 were directly serving military people. They weren't reservists or anything. They were active duty people. And gradually, people from OSS and new recruitment began to fill up the agency. But that took years. That got into the Allen Dulles era in the Eisenhower administration. During the late 40s, the number of civilians that rolled into the agency gradually was a relatively small number. I say relatively small with respect to, say, today. And among them, though, were some very strong OSS residual members who were well-trained in the side of covert work that involves clandestine operations. And despite the fact that that was totally overlooked in the law, even so much as to suppress that kind of activity by not putting it in the law and not creating a budget basis for that kind of expenditure of funds. The people with that training came into the CIA. Certainly the military wasn't going to get into that business, nor was the State Department. So it was a question of where do you keep this? So the residual OSS capability fell into the lap of the CIA. But even then, that took years. That didn't happen until General Walter Beetle Smith came home from Russia, where he had been ambassador to Russia, and became the director of Central Intelligence in, I believe, about 1950.
October of 1950.
And at that time, he brought Alan Dulles in as his deputy director of plans, which means in charge of covert operations. Well, Dulles had been with the OSS. And then he announced to the president that if he was going to be in charge, if he was going to be the director of Central Intelligence, he was going to have OPC under him and not scattered around with responsibilities in the State Department and the Defense Department. A lot has been said about OPC in the sense that how could such an organization have been created without law, and how was this ingenious little device of appointing its senior officer? The way it read was that he would be nominated by one secretary, either State or Defense, and having to be seconded by the other, and then would be approved, and as though he didn't have a single commander. Well, everybody knew that was temporary, and it had no real significance, because the real things that OPC was doing was to preserve certain assets, certain highly classified assets of World War II. He was not initiating operations. Now, I don't mean to say that disregarding some of the very practical things that were being done. For instance, we had clandestine operations underway in Greece as a result of the Greek Civil War right after the World War II, and these spilled over into Bulgaria and nearby countries across the Greek border. We had other operations going on in China, but relatively speaking, they were small, and they were, again, residuals of World War II. They were not planned operations as against some communist nation or that kind of thing. They were there, but they existed, and this was there. And the chief of OPC at the time was Frank Wisner, who had been a very dominant OSS leader in Eastern Europe during World War II, and later who led this massive campaign against Indonesia in 1958. So Wisner was very active in the covert activities. But when General Smith became the DCI, he insisted upon bringing that group into the agency. Now, strictly speaking, that was not supported by law. It was sort of an expedient. One of the most important facets of this National Security Act of 1947 was the creation of the National Security Council. We had not had something like that in peacetime in other years, not under Roosevelt and not before, and I don't even recall anything like that in the World War I period. What was decided was that there are times when, for purposes of national security, there must be top-level decisions, and that the President needed assistance in making those decisions. So the National Security Council, by law, is the President, the Vice President, the Secretary of State, and the Secretary of Defense. No others. They can invite others, and others do attend the meetings, but there are no other statutory members. If we relate that to today's affairs, in all these questions about the Iran and Contra hearings and all those problems, there could not have been a decision about covert operations involving the Contras or Iran or exchange of hostages or any of that without a decision from the National Security Council. That's by law. There's no other way to do it other than an illegal way, and I don't think that's ever even been assumed, that there had to be decisions from the National Security Council. From my own experience and background, I just cannot believe that the members of the National Security Council during this Iran-Contra period have removed themselves from the whole thing as though they had nothing to do with it. That's preposterous. By law, they had to. If they didn't do it, they were derelict in their duty, and they should be tried for that. That's what the National Security Council was created to do. And in the 40s, the National Security Council met and created a directive which I believe is called 10-2. And 10-2 recognized that the U.S. government might from time to time be involved or involve itself in covert action. Generally, this would mean relatively small activities, not major warfare like the Korean War or the Vietnam War, that kind of thing, not even like the invasion of Cuba at the Bay of Pigs. I believe these were truly clandestine covert actions, and there were many of them. Later on, when I got into this business in the 50s, we had things like that going all the time, but they were small. Now, the decision to involve the United States in covert action had to be made by this National Security Council. No one else had the authority. And you see, that means even that the DCI, the head of the intelligence agency, was not part of the National Security Council. Therefore, he was not involved in the decision. He would be told about the decision. Well, during the 40s and the early 50s, things worked that way. In 1948, a rather important thing happened. President Truman wanted to have a highly qualified group study how the CIA was moving along, how it was progressing, and whether or not it was becoming effective. Really, the signal primary character of the CIA is Mr. Dulles. There's no question about it. It's his agency, and nobody else has left any mark like his. The OCB was the Operations Coordinating Board, which was a part of NSC by law. OCB was intended to be a group of senior individuals, or it was a group of senior individuals who would follow the decisions made by the National Security Council and make sure that the bureaucracy carried them out. That was the function of the OCB, a different organization. The Operations Policy, OPC, the Operations Policy Committee, right, was the residual OSS organization that was under Frank Wisner, and an extremely distinct organization from OCB. Okay. The OPC had been created only without law. See, it came from World War II. It was a necessary function. It was like sweeping up things left on the floor after the war. We had to keep alive the records from the OSS, and it was agreed to put this organization only structurally within the State Department, but to control its chief by making the new Secretary of Defense and his counterpart, the Secretary of State, responsible for the leader of the organization, giving him some control that way. The budgetary function was minimal. It was just a matter of paying people, that's about all, and taking care of the records. A lot of people have misinterpreted the OPC, although when it gradually worked its way into the CIA under Beadle Smith, it did become dominant. Again, it became rather strong, and it became the main clandestine operations sector of the agency, later known as the Deputy Director of Plans. Now we'll go back to Mr. Dulles and how he was able to circumvent the law. And really the best way is to say again that the report that he had written with Korea and with Jackson outlined his vision of how the CIA ought to be. He believed that. He thought that it ought to have a full intelligence powers, including secret intelligence, and that it ought to have the clandestine capability to carry out any operations directed by the National Security Council. Well, by the time, see, he thought that could be started in 49. But by the time he got to be the DCI, things hadn't worked that way. The CIA had been kept rather quiet. It was coordinating intelligence, and it was doing very little in the covert activities field. He felt that should change, but he didn't have any law to do it. So what he did is he would take a plan that they had made up because of some input from a foreign country or from one of his station chiefs around the world that was in response to some action. Well, then he'd go to the National Security Council They didn't direct him to go to X country and do something. They were approving something that he felt he ought to do in response to an action that some of his operators, some of his agents had seen in a foreign country. And that device enabled him to create activities as though they were reaction, and most of the time they were, or responses. And so the NSC found itself not directing covert operations, but approving reactive covert operations. There's quite a bit of difference. But when you're doing that with an organization like the CIA, under an ambitious leader like Allen Dulles, it's pretty hard to tell the difference, because sometimes you can create a response by kicking somebody under the table and they pound you in the nose, then you point to your partner and say, look at that guy just hit me. You didn't know you kicked him under the table. The best example, the absolute best example I know of that tactic was the Gulf of Tonkin incident. The Vietnamese, the North Vietnamese that came out in the vicinity of the destroyers, which the Navy now admits were never even hit by anything fired at them, probably not even fired at. But the why those North Vietnamese Comar ships, very high-speed ships, came out there was because they had been hit clandestinely. So that the first act was by our own forces, aided with South Vietnamese. Then when the North Vietnamese came out, they had been provoked. They did not initiate the attack. But in the discussion of that, both by President Johnson and in Congress, when they were discussing the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, they were only told that the attack had been made by the North Vietnamese upon our Navy without provocation. So you can control covert activities by using that same device to kick under the table, and then you can say, hey, now look what happened in the Congo, or look what happened in Indonesia, or look what happened in Tibet. We've got to do something about it. This was the technique that Dulles was the master of working at, and he tried to have the agency ready to be responsive anywhere in the world. And of course he had to do it that way because there were no plans. They didn't sit here and say, well, here's what we see happening in such and such a country, and here's what we think ought to be done, and here's how the United States should get in there with a covert operation to perform this or that. You know, there was none of that. There was no planning shop. In fact, I've always thought, and I worked very closely with them, that one of the strangest devices they used was to call their covert operations the Deputy Director Plans, because there were no plans. I worked with them intimately for 9 years. I never saw a single plan come out of the Deputy Director Plans. And of course they would simply smile and say, well, that's just our euphemism for covert operations.
I'd like to quote a part here regarding the intelligence community as a whole. You wrote that on page 141 of The Secret Team, over the years it has become customary to speak of the various intelligence organizations within the government as members of the community. This word is quite proper because there is little cohesion and homogeneity within this vast infrastructure which has cost so much and which performs so many varied and separate functions. The members of the community are the CIA, the Army, Navy, and Air Force as separate divisions, the Defense Intelligence Agency, the FBI, the Atomic Energy Commission, the State Department, and the National Security Agency.
The National Security Agency. Just think what any of these would be without the National Security Agency. They all depend upon the National Security Agency for the intercept of electronic transmission and all the other things, communications intelligence and all the rest. Well, the National Security Agency is a function of the Department of Defense. Now, this, what we've been talking about, emphasizes the very great importance of the National Security Council. If the President, the Vice President, the Secretary of State, and the Secretary of Defense can't handle the CIA, nobody can. And if they permit the funding from Congress or any other really covert work to put CIA into areas that they didn't approve, it's their fault. Nobody else's. This is one of the serious things about this recent Iran thing, that it seems as though Congress wants to accept the fact that Poindexter, McFarlane, North, and all those men were doing things that the NSC didn't approve. And they are legitimizing that, which is terrible. You know, really, for the future, is a terrible thing to put up with. We've got a law that says if you're going to get into clandestine operations, it can only be done at the direction of the National Security Council. Yeah. And here we have the men who were members of the National Security Council, Reagan, Bush, Weinberger, and Schultz, all walking off and saying we had nothing to do with it. That, for the next era, is an enormous problem. And if Congress doesn't recognize what's happening, they better do it pretty soon, because they're going to find covert things going on that nobody knows anything about. Because what they are doing then is regularizing what I said in my book, that there exists a secret team that's out of control. Mm-hmm. And now they have regularized that, you see. That's the danger. If they don't keep the National Security Council over these organizations, they'll never get the genie back in the bottle. Mr. Bush, even today, is saying, I didn't do anything down in Honduras, or I didn't do anything when I met with the Israelis, or the, you know. It's appalling, because if they're going to accept that, they're denying the role of the National Security Council, and then they're permitting almost anybody else in the government to run covert operations. Yeah. Now, that's something else people need to understand about covert operations. We talk about the CIA being in charge of covert operations. Almost any branch of the government gets into covert operations, and they do it in a team fashion. That's why I called it the secret team, because I saw just as many people working in covert operations in Customs Service, in the Treasury Service, even in FAA sometimes, as I did when we saw CIA people and defense people working. It just depends on what type of operation you're in or who wants it done. Mm-hmm. It's not the CIA all the time, although they all get together and say it was the CIA. The CIA might have just had a representative in there. Or the CIA would provide its special communications and its other facilities that they have. As we heard in the case of Ollie North and the others, they had these special communications devices and all that. But other people were doing the jobs, you see.
You write further on concerning the realization of the Dulles-Jackson Correa's report's method of placing CIA agents throughout the government, quote, "Many of these people who have reached positions of great responsibility, I believe that the most powerful and certainly the most useful agent the CIA has ever had operates in just such a capacity within another branch of the government, and he has been there for so long that few have any idea that he is a long-term career agent of the CIA. Through his most excellent and skillful services, more CIA operations have been enabled to take place than can be laid at the feet of the agency, at the feet of any other, more legitimate agent. This was the plan and the wisdom of the Dulles idea from the beginning. On the basis of security, he would place people in all areas of the government, and then he would move them up and deeper into their cover jobs, until they began to take a very active part in the role of their own organizations. This is how the ST was born, the secret team. Today, the role of the CIA is performed by an ad hoc organization that is much greater in size, strength, and resources than the CIA has ever been visualized to be." So the first question I have here would be, how, quote, on the basis of security, unquote, would Allen Dulles, quote, place people in all other areas of the government?
Well, one of the first things that I realized was that it was Mr. Dulles' desire to have the office that General White asked me to create in the Air Force headquarters in order to create a focal point system. And as Mr. Dulles told me later, he said, I don't want various people from my agency going into the Pentagon and dealing with different people there, and therefore uncovering the activities of the CIA to a large number of people, because obviously such a ring would then proliferate to others, and if they wanted submarines, they'd have to bring in some Navy people, and if they wanted helicopters, they'd have to talk to some Army people. He said, I want a focal point. I want an office that's cleared to do what we have to have done, an office that knows us very, very well, and then an office has access to a system in the Pentagon, but the system will not be aware of what initiated the request. They'll think it came from the Secretary of Defense. They won't realize it came from the Director of Central Intelligence. So you see, the Dulles philosophy was to control the focal point area. This led then to the creation of focal point offices everywhere. And as I established this Tab 6 organization, we called it, in every major staff area within the Air Force, because that was my jurisdiction at the time, I would have cleared people, another focal point, you might say a sub-focal point, a person I could go to who had been given ahead of time the authority to do whatever it was that he was authorized to do. And we stressed that authorized business. He would have to be sure he had orders either from my office or directly up to the Chief of Staff, and that we knew what we were doing for CIA. Well, this leads to another step you might call breeding. We had to work with various agencies of the government, not just the Defense Department. We had to have contact points in the State Department, in the FAA, in the Customs Service, in the Treasury, in the FBI, and all around through the government, up in the White House. And gradually we wove a network of people who understood the symbols and the code names and the things we were doing and how we handled money, which was the most important thing. And then we began to assign people there who those agencies thought were from the Defense Department, but they actually were people that we put there from the CIA. This led to the creation of a system of powerful individuals, people whose jobs were quite dominant in some of these other agencies, especially after they'd been there 2 or 3 years, because we put them in there by talking to the top man, the cabinet officer or the head of the agency, and we'd say, this man is being placed here so that he can facilitate covert activities and so that he can retain the secrecy that's required, and he will keep you informed at all times. Well, in the bureaucracy, the top people move faster than anybody else, not the bottom people. And so the man we had explained that to maybe a year and a half earlier would be transferred or leave the government, but our man is still there. So 1 or 2 cycles of that, and that agency might not even know that guy was there anymore. They would, and I mean, what his origins were, they would think he was just another one of their own employees. And as a result, he became extremely effective, because if we wanted something done, I remember a rather very sensitive operation that I needed some information on, and I needed it from the FBI. I didn't go to the FBI. I went to this guy that we had planted, and he got it twice as fast and in a much better form than I would have gotten from the FBI, even though I was at that time working from the Office of Secretary of Defense. We had no trouble working with the FBI. It was just to facilitate it. These people became very, very adept. By the same token, people that were employees of CIA, agents, were assigned even in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. We had certain people there who were CIA employees. Ed Lansdale worked for CIA all his adult career. A person named Frank Hand worked there. Now, the people in the Pentagon thought they were ordinary military employees. They didn't realize, well, just to give you an example, Colonel Lansdale was a full colonel in the Air Force. That was his cover story. And he had been a full colonel for a few years. And the Air Force was promoting some men to general. The question came up, would Lansdale be eligible? And I told Mr. Dulles personally, I said, you know, you can make Lansdale a general if you just write a letter to General LeMay, because you're going to pay the bills anyway, and not the Air Force. A few days later, I got a call from General LeMay's office. He called me in, and he had the list of men that the Air Force was promoting to general. And as I recall, it was only 13 or 14 officers, and LeMay, being General LeMay, knew every one of them in except one. I don't know who the hell he is. I'm not going to promote him to a general. And I said, well, don't you have a file on him? He said, yes. He opened it up, and the top letter was from Allen Dulles. I said, he's a very important man for Allen Dulles. It's okay, I'll promote him. Just like that. Well, that's a good way to get a promotion, you see. But that created a very important job within the structure of the Office of Secretary of Defense. Frank Hand had been there for years in the same way. Frank was a civilian of, I always wrote that he was the most important agent that the agency had, because he was operating daily and effectively as a member of the Office of Secretary of Defense. And you can think of the things that a person in that capacity can do when his home base really is CIA. Well, although people didn't believe this when they first heard it, there are assignments like that in the White House. There are assignments like that in the State Department. It's hard to tell the difference, you might say, between Bill Bundy, who was a longtime CIA employee, and McGeorge Bundy, who was in the White House with Kennedy. The two brothers certainly want to act side by side. They have the same goals and the same intentions. Well, there were many things that duplicated like that. So that it wasn't long before, and I'd say by the end of the 50s, early 60s, before we had spread through the government what I called a secret team, a group of people who really knew how to operate the CIA business.